This is the story of a disturbing real spring break horror I'm going to tell you. And trust me, once you hear it, you'll never think of spring break the same way again. It happened just 2 years ago. My friend Katie and I were in college, and like most students, we were dying for a break. You know, to get away from classes, stress, everything. We planned a trip to Florida. Not the usual places like Miami or Panama City. No. Katie found this small beach town online, quiet, cheap, and not full of wild tourists. It sounded perfect. Too perfect, maybe. We drove there ourselves, took my old car and packed it with snacks, swimsuits, and excitement. The drive took a whole day. But when we reached the town, it looked like something out of a postcard. The beach was quiet, the air smelled like salt and sunshine, and the rental house we booked looked even better than the pictures. The owner of the house was this old man named Mr. Hutchins. He looked like he was in his 70s, thin, with sunburnt skin and watery blue eyes. He handed us the key and gave us a strange warning. He said, "Be careful near the woods behind the house. Some things aren't meant to be disturbed." We laughed it off. We weren't there to go exploring in the woods. We wanted beach, sun, and maybe a few drinks. The first couple of days were perfect. We laid on the beach, watched the sunset, and played music. We met 2 guys from Georgia staying nearby, Nick and Riley. They were fun, harmless, and knew how to keep the party going. So we hung out a lot. Then things started to change. It began with noises at night, the kind that made you sit up in bed and hold your breath. Scratching, tapping, like fingers on the windows. At first, we thought it was just the wind, or maybe some animal. But every night, it got louder, closer. One night, Katie swore she saw someone watching her through the window while she was brushing her hair. But when she pulled the curtain back, there was nothing there. No footsteps, no prints in the sand, nothing. We told Nick and Riley, and they joked about it. They said maybe the house was haunted by spring break spirits who never left. It made us laugh for a second, but that night, we heard footsteps in the hallway, inside the house. I swear to you, I wasn't dreaming. I heard each step. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, but the hallway was empty. Katie didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, we checked the locks. Everything was still locked. No signs of forced entry. That should have made us feel better, but it didn't. It made it worse. Because if no one came in, then who or what was walking around? On the 4th day, Riley dared us all to go into the woods behind the house. We remembered Mr. Hutchins's warning, but we were all tired of being scared. We thought, maybe if we just went in there and saw it was nothing, the fear would stop. So we went. The woods were thicker than they looked from the house. Cold, even though the sun was out. There was this strange silence in there, like the trees were holding their breath. About a half-mile in, we found something that made our blood run cold. A circle of stones. Not just a fire pit or anything like that. This looked like something ancient. The stones were carved like with symbols or letters we didn't understand. In the middle was a pile of animal bones, fresh ones. Katie wanted to leave right away. She said her head was spinning and her stomach felt sick. I agreed. But Nick, being the idiot he was, kicked one of the stones and laughed. "Spring break demon circle," he joked. That night, Katie got a nosebleed that wouldn't stop. I had dreams, terrible ones, of someone standing at the foot of my bed, whispering words I couldn't understand. I'd wake up and feel like someone had just walked out of the room. The next day, Nick didn't show up. Riley said he went for a walk that morning but never came back. We called his phone. No answer. We searched the beach, the roads, and finally, yes, the woods. But he was gone. We called the police. They searched too, but found nothing. No signs of struggle, no trail. He just vanished. That night, we stayed inside, all three of us. But it didn't matter. Something didn't want us there anymore. The lights kept flickering. Doors slammed on their own. And worst of all, we heard someone crying in the walls. Katie lost it. She screamed and said we needed to leave now in the middle of the night. Riley agreed. We packed what we could and got in my car. But when I turned the key, the engine made a horrible grinding sound and died. Dead battery. I never forgot how. Katie looked at me pale and shaking and said, "We're not getting out." We ran to the neighbor's house, a woman named Martha. She let us in and called a tow truck. She also looked sad, like she had seen this before. When I asked her, she said something I'll never forget. "You should have never gone into those woods. That place is cursed. A girl disappeared there last year, same time, same kind of trip. They never found her." I don't know if it was a curse or a ghost or something older than all of that. But the next day, we left. I never saw Nick again. His parents put up missing posters. A year later, the case was still cold. No leads, no clues. Just a gap where a person should be. Katie doesn't talk about it anymore. Riley moved away. I still have nightmares sometimes. About stone circles, woods that whisper, and faces in the dark. And every spring when the air starts to warm and people talk about vacations and parties, I remember that one spring break. The one that wasn't a break at all. The one that broke something inside us. So if you ever find a rental in a quiet beach town that seems too cheap and too perfect, and if someone warns you about the woods behind the house, listen to them. Don't go in. Don't disturb what's meant to be left alone. Because some stories don't end with answers. Some stories just stay with you forever. This is the story of a spring break horror that I'm about to tell you. And believe me, it's not one you'll forget. It's the kind of story that'll make you think twice about your next getaway. Especially if you're planning on heading to the woods or anywhere isolated. It all started with me and my best friend, Mark. We were both fresh out of college, trying to shake off the stress and celebrate. Spring break was the perfect excuse, and like most college students, we had our minds set on partying. But instead of going to the usual places like Cancun or Daytona Beach, we decided on something a little quieter, a little more secluded. We found a small cabin in the woods up north, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. It seemed like the perfect place to unwind. The cabin was old, built with thick logs and surrounded by dense trees. When we arrived, the first thing I noticed was the smell of the forest, pine and earth, fresh and clean. The air was crisp, and there was a slight chill in the wind. The town nearby was tiny, with just a few shops and a couple of restaurants. Not the kind of place you'd expect to find many tourists. We were excited to get away from the usual chaos, just the two of us, away from everything. The owner of the cabin was a man named Jacob. He wasn't very talkative, but he seemed nice enough. He showed us around the place, explained how everything worked, and then handed us the keys. As he was leaving, he said something odd. "Stay out of the woods after dark. It's not safe." We both laughed it off, thinking it was just some weird local superstition. But when we got inside the cabin, I noticed something strange. The walls were covered with old photographs, faded black and white pictures of people standing in front of the cabin. Families, friends, all from different decades. There was something eerie about them. but I couldn't place it. Mark didn't seem to notice, and we were both too eager to start our vacation to think about it too much. The first few days were great. We hiked around, went fishing in a nearby lake, and spent evenings around the fireplace, drinking beers and talking about the future. But as the sun began to set each day, something felt off. It was the silence. It was the kind of silence that presses down on you, heavy and suffocating. The kind that makes you want to break it with noise, any noise, just to feel like you're not alone. But there was no noise, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the far-off call of an owl. On the fourth night, things took a weird turn. We were sitting on the porch enjoying the last of the day's warmth when Mark suddenly looked over at me, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice tight. I shook my head. "What?" That sound. It's coming from the woods." I listened carefully. At first I couldn't hear anything, but then, faintly, almost like it was carried by the wind, I heard it too. A low, hollow sound, like a drum beat. Slow, steady. It wasn't something you'd expect to hear in the middle of the forest. Mark got up, grabbed a flashlight, and headed toward the trees. I hesitated, but curiosity got the best of me. I followed him, but the further we went into the woods, the more the atmosphere changed. The air became thick, almost suffocating. It felt like we were being watched. We kept walking, the sound of the drum growing louder with every step. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Mark led the way, but suddenly he stopped, his flashlight illuminating something in the distance. There, in a small clearing, was an old, weathered structure. It looked like a forgotten altar, stones arranged in a circle with symbols carved into them. The ground around it was marked with strange, twisted symbols I didn't recognize. I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something wrong about this place, something I couldn't explain. Mark didn't seem to care, though. He was already moving closer, inspecting the altar like it was just another curiosity. But as he reached out to touch one of the stones, the sound stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the drum beat. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. I wanted to leave, but my feet felt frozen to the ground. And then I saw it, just in the corner of my vision. A figure standing in the trees, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall, thin, and dressed in something dark, almost like a cloak. I could barely make out its face, but the eyes, those eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring straight at us. I grabbed Mark's arm and yanked him back. "We need to go," I said, my voice trembling. He looked at me like I was crazy. "Relax. It's just some old ruins. There's nothing here." But I couldn't shake the feeling. That thing, whatever it was still out there watching. And something told me we weren't supposed to be there. We left the clearing and started walking back to the cabin. But that's when things got worse. The woods seemed to close in around us, and the path I thought we'd come from was suddenly gone. We were lost. We wandered for what felt like hours, the trees now pressing in on all sides. The air grew colder, and the silence grew heavier. Every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the shadows, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Eventually, we stumbled upon a small shack. It looked abandoned, but it was a place to rest, so we went inside. The door creaked open, and we stepped into the dimly lit space. The smell of rot and dust hit us immediately, but there was something else too, something faintly sweet like old flowers. The floorboards groaned under our weight as we moved through the shack, searching for a way out of the forest. But when Mark shone the flashlight around, His beam landed on something strange. A mirror. It was cracked, the edges blackened with age, and in the reflection, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a face behind us, not ours, but someone else's, someone pale, with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into a grin. I turned around, but there was no one there. I don't know how we made it out of those woods that night, but when we finally returned to the cabin, everything felt wrong. The air was thick, the silence deafening. We didn't say a word to each other as we packed up and left the next morning, not even bothering to say goodbye to Jacob or ask him about the cabin's past. We just drove straight back home, both of us too shaken to speak. A few weeks later, I heard the news. A young couple had gone missing, reported last seen in that same area. They'd been hiking in the woods. The police found nothing but their abandoned gear near the edge of the forest. No bodies, no signs of struggle, nothing. Just an empty forest, waiting. And I'll never forget what happened to us that spring break. It wasn't just the strange sounds, the eerie woods, or the thing we saw in the mirror. It was the feeling that something was watching us, waiting. And I can't shake the thought that it's still out there, somewhere, waiting for the next person to come along. So if you ever think about going on a trip to some quiet, secluded cabin in the woods, be careful, because some places are better left undisturbed. This is the story of a terrifying night that happened to me and my friend Chris one summer a few years ago. I still can't shake the memories of that night, and sometimes when I'm alone, I can almost hear the faint sounds that haunted us. If you ever find yourself in the middle of nowhere far from help, you might want to turn around before it's too late. It started as an innocent weekend getaway. Chris and I had been working non-stop for months, and we were desperate for a break. We both loved the outdoors, camping, hiking, fishing, so when we found an isolated cabin in the woods upstate, we jumped on it. It was a rustic place, deep in the forest, miles away from any town. The kind of place where you could really disconnect from the world. The cabin was small but charming, nestled by a lake with a beautiful view of the surrounding trees. The owner, an older man named Thomas, met us when we arrived. He was kind, but there was something odd about him. He had these deep-set eyes that made it hard to look at him for too long. Still, he seemed harmless enough, and he told us all the basics: how to start the fire, where to find the wood, and most importantly, not to go near the abandoned shack deep in the forest. He said, "Stay away from it, especially after sunset. It's been there for years, but it's not a place for visitors. Trust me on this." Of course, Chris and I found that interesting, but we figured he was just trying to protect us from getting lost or hurt. It was the first time we'd ever rented a cabin in a place this remote, so maybe we were just being overly cautious. We spent the first few days hiking, fishing, and relaxing by the lake. Everything was perfect. But on the fourth day, something happened. It was a clear evening, and we were sitting outside, enjoying a beer and watching the sunset. The peaceful atmosphere was suddenly interrupted by something strange. We heard a loud bang coming from the direction of the woods. I stood up, straining my ears. "What was that?" I asked. Chris didn't look worried. "Probably a tree falling. Happens all the time out here." I wasn't so sure. The sound had been too close, and it felt off. But we decided to ignore it, not wanting to ruin our peaceful evening. That night, though, as we lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a weird silence outside, like even the wind had stopped. I kept hearing faint sounds, scratching against the cabin's walls, a low whispering that I couldn't place. I tried to ignore it, but when I glanced at Chris, I saw that he was wide awake too. His eyes were glued to the ceiling, his body tense. "Are you hearing that?" he whispered. I nodded. "Yeah. I don't know what it is." We both stayed silent for a long time, listening. The whispers continued, but we couldn't figure out where they were coming from. Suddenly, there was a loud thud at the door. I jumped up, heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight. We both rushed to the front door, but when I opened it, there was nothing there. The air was cold, and the only thing I could see was the vast darkness of the woods surrounding the cabin. "Maybe it's an animal," Chris said, trying to sound calm. But I could tell he didn't believe it either. The next morning, we went to the lake to clear our heads. We fished for a while, but neither of us said much. The weirdness from the night before still lingered in the air. When we got back to the cabin, we noticed something different. The front door was slightly ajar. "Did you leave the door open last night?" Chris asked, frowning. "No," I said. "I locked it before we went to bed." We went inside, checking the place over, but everything seemed to be in its place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension that made it hard to relax. That night, we decided to take a walk through the woods to try to shake off the weird feeling. We didn't make it far before we heard it, the same bang from the night before. This time it was louder, closer. And then we heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone was walking just behind us. I turned to Chris. "Did you hear that?" Chris didn't answer. He was frozen, staring into the darkness. There, just beyond the trees, I saw it. A shadow moving quickly, disappearing into the thick woods. My heart raced. "Chris, we need to go back. Now." But Chris didn't move. He was staring intently at the shadow, his eyes wide. "Do you see that?" he whispered. I looked again, but the shadow was gone. The woods were silent. Too silent. I grabbed Chris's arm. "Let's go." We turned and walked quickly back to the cabin, the sound of footsteps still following us. When we got inside, we locked every door and window, our nerves completely on edge. That night was worse than the last. The whispering was back, louder, now. It sounded like it was coming from all directions. The door creaked, like someone was gently pushing against it from the outside. Then, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it. A low, raspy voice close to my ear, whispering my name. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. "Chris," I whispered, shaking him awake. He looked at me with panic in his eyes. I heard it, too. The whispering stopped, and then there was a knock at the door. Light, like someone was trying to get our attention. I was done. I grabbed the keys, and without a word, I headed for the car. Chris followed me, but when we reached the driveway, we froze. There, standing at the edge of the woods, was the figure of a man. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and his face was obscured by shadows. We didn't wait around to see what he would do. We got into the car and sped away without looking back. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town. That night, we stayed at a cheap motel, but neither of us slept. The image of the man in the woods haunted us, and we couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, even as we drove farther away. The next day, we drove back to the cabin to check it out one last time, but when we arrived, there was no sign of the man. The door was still locked and everything seemed untouched, but when I checked the guest book Thomas had left on the kitchen counter, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Written in shaky handwriting were the words, "Don't go near the woods. They never leave you." I still don't know what happened that night or who that man was, but I've never gone back to that cabin. The memory still haunts me, And every summer when the days start to grow long and the nights grow still, I can't help but wonder if there's something out there in the woods that no one is supposed to see. So, if you ever find yourself in the woods far from anyone and you hear footsteps behind you, don't turn around, don't look, just walk away, because you might not like what you find. This is the story of a guy named Jack who learned the hard way that some things are better left undisturbed. You know, I don't usually tell stories like this, but when you hear what happened to Jack, maybe you'll understand why I couldn't keep it to myself. It all started when Jack decided to move into an old house he found on the edge of town. He'd been living in an apartment for years, always stuck in the city life, dealing with the noise and stress of the concrete jungle. But he wanted peace, space, and something different. So when he found a secluded old farmhouse for rent, cheap, too, he couldn't resist. The house wasn't much to look at. It had peeling paint, a sagging porch, and a yard that hadn't been mowed in a long time. But the price was right, and the quiet was exactly what Jack needed. He didn't know much about the place, only that it had been sitting vacant for over a decade. But who cares? He was excited to start fresh, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. He moved in, unpacked his things, and spent the first few days exploring the property. The house itself was surprisingly large for such a rundown place. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a big kitchen, and a spacious living room. The real attraction, however, was the land. Behind the house was a stretch of overgrown grass and trees, with a small creek running through the far side of the yard. For the first few weeks, things were peaceful. Jack had no neighbors for miles, and the closest store was a small corner shop a few miles down the road. But that didn't bother him. He was perfectly content with his new, isolated life. It wasn't until one evening, just after sunset, that things started to get weird. Jack was sitting in his living room drinking a cold beer when he heard something. It was a low, creaking sound, like a door slowly opening. Jack frowned and glanced around the room. The house was quiet. He stood up and walked through the hall, checking every room, but there was nothing. No open windows, no doors ajar. Everything was exactly as it should be, but the sound didn't stop. It continued, a slow, rhythmic creak from somewhere in the house. It was faint, like it was coming from upstairs, but Jack couldn't figure out where. He climbed the stairs cautiously, his heart pounding with every step. When he reached the top, the sound seemed to be coming from the last room at the end of the hall, a small bedroom he hadn't really looked at yet. Jack hesitated for a moment. He'd seen the room when he first toured the house, but he hadn't bothered to open the door. The floorboards creaked under his feet as he made his way toward it. He reached out and turned the handle. The door swung open with a long, drawn-out squeal, and Jack stepped inside. The room was dark, save for the faint light coming through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. Dust hung in the air, and the furniture was covered in thick, white sheets. But that wasn't what caught his attention. It was the old rocking chair. In the corner, the chair was moving, slowly, back and forth, creaking with every sway. Jack's blood ran cold. He had not touched it. The room was empty, and there was no breeze to explain it. Yet there it was, rocking on its own. Jack took a step forward, his breath shallow. He reached out and touched the chair, hoping to stop it. But when his hand made contact, the rocking stopped. A chill ran down his spine. He stood there for a moment, trying to calm himself. "It's just an old house," he muttered, trying to convince himself. But deep down, he knew there was something off about this place. The next morning, Jack was still unsettled by what had happened. He figured it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, so he tried to forget about it. But that night, the creaking started again. Louder this time. And this time, it didn't stop. He stood frozen in his living room, staring at the staircase. The sound was unmistakable. It was coming from the upstairs bedroom. Without thinking, Jack grabbed a flashlight and headed up there again. When he reached the room, the rocking chair was moving even faster. The low creak of the wood filled the air, and Jack's stomach twisted. This time, however, he noticed something else. A faint whisper, like a voice calling his name. Jack. Jack. The voice was so faint that he thought he might be imagining it. But no, it was real. It was coming from the chair. He stepped closer, his legs trembling with fear. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaking. The chair stopped moving. For a long moment, everything was still. Jack's heart thudded in his chest, and he stood there, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then, suddenly, the floor beneath him creaked, and the door to the room slammed shut behind him. Jack spun around in panic, banging his back against the door. He tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. He was trapped. He could hear the whispers again, growing louder. The voice was no longer just calling his name. Now it was chanting something, over and over again. "Get out! Get out!" Jack's head spun and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He grabbed the doorknob, pulling with all his strength, but the door remained locked. That's when he saw it, something moving in the corner of the room. At first it was just a shadow, but then it began to take shape. A figure, tall and thin, emerged from the darkness. It was wearing tattered clothes, its face hidden in shadows. The figure moved toward him, its steps slow but deliberate. Jack's heart raced. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The figure reached out, its cold, bony hand brushing against his arm. Jack screamed, finally managing to break free of his paralysis, and shoved the door open. He ran down the stairs, his breath ragged, his legs shaking. He didn't stop running until he was outside, in the fresh night air. But when he looked back at the house, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the window of the room, he saw the figure again, standing behind the boarded-up window. It was watching him. Jack didn't waste another second. He grabbed his keys and left. He didn't care about his things or the house anymore. All he cared about was getting as far away from that place as possible. He stayed with a friend for a few days, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. Something from the house. He never went back. That's the thing about old houses. They carry memories, things that shouldn't be disturbed. Jack learned that the hard way. Sometimes when you open the door to something that's been forgotten, it might not let you leave.